If you were alive in the 1980s, if you remember when MTV actually played music videos, if you ever stood in line at a record store waiting for a Prince album to drop at midnight, then you thought you knew him. We all did. The purple suits, the provocative lyrics, the guitar solos that seemed to defy physics. We thought we understood the man behind the symbol. Susan Rogers actually did know him. Not the stage persona, not the carefully crafted public image. She knew the Prince who showed up at the studio at midnight with dark circles under his eyes and worked until dawn broke. The Prince who recorded 70 songs in a single month. The Prince who demanded perfection from himself in ways that would break most people. The Prince who, sometimes, in those quiet moments between takes, seemed desperately, achingly alone, despite being surrounded by people every hour of every day. For 5 years, she was one of maybe 3 or 4 people in the world who saw him without the armor, without the performance. Just a man in a recording booth, trying to turn the noise in his head into something beautiful before it consumed him entirely. And she thought, like we all thought, that talent was enough, that genius was protection, that someone who could create Purple Rain was somehow invincible, somehow exempt from the ordinary human weaknesses that destroy regular people. She was wrong. The morning she found out how wrong, she was 28 years old, at the peak of her career, working with the biggest star in the world. The studio clock read 5:47 a.m. She'd brought coffee, black, no sugar, the way Prince liked it during marathon sessions. She had notes about the previous night's mixes. She was ready for another 18-hour day of sonic perfection. She wasn't ready for what waited on the other side of that soundproof door. Nobody could have been ready for that. Before we continue with what Susan discovered that morning, if you want to hear more untold stories from Prince's inner circle, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that didn't make it into the official biography. Susan Rogers didn't arrive at Paisley Park through traditional music industry pathways. In 1983, she was a 23-year-old maintenance engineer at a recording studio in Los Angeles, more comfortable with circuit boards and signal flow than celebrity culture. She fixed broken equipment. She soldered connections. She understood the technical architecture of sound in ways most producers never would. Prince found her by accident. His equipment had malfunctioned during a session at Sunset Sound, and Susan was called in to repair it. While other engineers fumbled with explanations, she simply fixed the problem, explained what had gone wrong in precise technical language, and left. No fawning, no requests for autographs, just competent professional work. 3 days later, Prince called her personally. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He needed an engineer who understood machines as well as music, someone who could keep up with his relentless creative pace. He asked if she could start immediately. She said yes. That decision would define the next 5 years of her life and produce some of the most important albums in popular music history. But it would also require her to witness something that no amount of technical training could have prepared her for. The early days at Paisley Park felt like being inside a creative tornado. Prince worked in ways that defied conventional studio practice. Sessions would start at midnight and continue until dawn. Sometimes they'd stretch for 20, 30, 40 hours straight with only brief pauses. Susan learned to sleep in her car between sessions, to keep spare clothes in the studio, to function on 4 hours of rest and pure adrenaline. The output was staggering. In her first year alone, they recorded material that would fill multiple albums. Prince would conceive an entire song in his head, walk into the studio, and lay down all the instrumental tracks himself within hours. Guitar, bass, keyboards, drums. He played everything with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Susan's job was to capture it all, to translate his sonic vision into recorded reality without losing any of the raw energy or emotional intensity. She watched him work with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on pathological. A single snare hit would be recorded 50 times until it had exactly the right resonance. Vocal takes would be repeated endlessly, not because they were technically flawed, but because they didn't convey precisely the emotional texture he heard in his mind. Background harmonies would be constructed one layer at a time, building cathedrals of sound that most listeners would never consciously notice, but would feel in their bones. And through it all, Susan began to understand that she wasn't just witnessing talent. She was watching someone who used creativity as medication, who dove into music the way other people might reach for a drink or a pill, who seemed to fear silence and stillness the way most people fear death. The studio wasn't just his workplace. It was his refuge, his fortress, the only place where the noise inside his head made sense to anyone else. But there were signs, even early on, that something underneath the genius was fracturing. The way he would wince when standing up after long sessions, the increasing stiffness in his movements, particularly in his hips and lower back, the bottles that would appear occasionally on the console, prescription bottles with labels Susan couldn't quite read from her position at the mixing board. The nights when his energy would spike unnaturally, followed by crashes where he could barely hold his guitar. Susan told herself these were normal occupational hazards. Musicians pushed their bodies hard. Artists used whatever tools they needed to keep the creative flow going. This was just part of the territory, she reasoned. Part of the price of making history. When Purple Rain exploded in 1984, everything intensified. The album didn't just succeed, it dominated global culture in ways few records ever had. 24 weeks at #1, an Oscar for Best Original Song Score, 13 million copies sold within a year. Prince went from being a successful artist to being a phenomenon. Susan engineered much of that album, capturing the raw power of songs like When Doves Cry and the epic emotional sweep of the title track. She remembered the night they recorded the live guitar solo on Purple Rain. A single take captured during a concert at First Avenue in Minneapolis, with Prince pouring everything he had into 6 minutes of music that would define his career. But success brought new pressures. Prince was expected to top himself with each release, and Prince, being Prince, refused to repeat himself. The work pace accelerated. Around the World in a Day, Parade, Sign of the Times, each one a departure from the last. Susan marveled at his productivity, his constant forward motion. But she also noticed the toll. The physical discomfort was becoming harder to ignore. Prince had always been an intensely physical performer, dancing, jumping, doing splits on stage while playing guitar. Years of high-heeled boots and acrobatic stage moves had wreaked havoc on his joints. His hips were deteriorating. His ankles ached constantly. His back would spasm without warning. And the bottles on the console were appearing more frequently. Susan never asked about them directly. That wasn't the nature of their working relationship. Prince valued her precisely because she focused on the work and didn't pry into his personal life. So she noticed. She worried quietly, but she said nothing. She told herself that he was an adult who could make his own decisions, that his doctor presumably knew what he was prescribing, that pain management was a legitimate medical issue and not her business to judge. Looking back years later, Dr. Susan Rogers, the neuroscience professor she would become after leaving the music industry, would identify this as the moment when her silence became complicity. But in 1986 and 1987, sitting at that mixing console at 3 a.m, she didn't see it that way. She saw only the music, only the genius. Sign of the Times was the project that should have been the warning Susan couldn't ignore. The title track itself was a litany of social horrors and personal anxieties, AIDS, gang violence, drug addiction. It was Prince at his most vulnerable and socially conscious. Susan engineered those vocals, hearing the weariness in his voice, the sense of being overwhelmed by the darkness of the world. and perhaps by something darker brewing inside himself. They worked on that album through late 1986 and into early 1987, and Susan began to see changes that went beyond physical pain management. There were mood swings that seemed disconnected from the creative process. Bursts of manic energy followed by periods of withdrawn silence. Sessions that would be interrupted by Prince disappearing for hours, returning with renewed focus, but also with something off in his eyes. She wanted to ask. She wanted to say something. But every time she came close, the music would intervene. He'd play her a new track that was brilliant. He'd solve a mixing problem she'd been struggling with for hours. He'd remind her why she'd chosen to work with him in the first place. Because the work was extraordinary. Because opportunities like this came once in a lifetime. So she stayed silent. She engineered. She captured the sounds. She did her job. Until the morning when her job stopped being enough. April 1987. The Sign of the Times album was almost finished. Susan had been home for a few hours of actual sleep, a luxury she rarely afforded herself during intense production periods. She'd set her alarm for 5:30, planning to get to Paisley Park by 6 for another full day of work. She arrived early. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just Prince's car and one or two others. The building was quiet in that particular way large structures feel when they're mostly vacant. Not silent exactly, but hollow, with only the ambient hum of HVAC systems breaking the stillness. Susan used her key card to enter through the side entrance, made her way down the familiar hallways toward the basement studio. The coffee she'd brought, black, no sugar, just how Prince liked it, was still hot in her hand. She had her notebook full of observations from the previous day's mixes. She was thinking about track sequencing, about the emotional arc of the album, about technical details. She wasn't thinking about what she might find when she opened the studio door. The lights were off. Susan reached for the light switch, her other hand still holding the coffee cup, her mind still running through the day's planned tasks. The fluorescent lights flickered on, and Susan Rogers saw something that would end her career in the music industry and send her life in an entirely different direction. Prince was on the floor, not sitting, not in some meditation pose. He was crumpled on the studio floor near the mixing console, his body twisted at an angle that looked painful even from across the room. His eyes were closed. His skin had a grayish pallor that made Susan's medical alarms start screaming in her head. The coffee cup fell from her hand. She was moving toward him, her brain trying to process what she was seeing while her body operated on pure instinct. Check breathing, check pulse, call for help. But before she reached him, Prince's eyes opened. Not gradually. They snapped open, and for a moment Susan saw something in them that terrified her more than finding him unconscious had. A kind of empty panic. A disorientation so complete that he didn't seem to recognize where he was or who she was. Then, recognition filtered back in. The panic receded, behind the familiar mask of control. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, wincing at the movement, and looked at Susan standing frozen 3 feet away. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Just fell asleep. Long night." But Susan had seen the bottles. Multiple prescription bottles scattered near where he'd been lying. She'd seen them in that first moment when the lights came on. Orange plastic bottles with white caps, the kind that come from pharmacies. Too many of them. "Prince, she started, but he cut her off. I said, "I'm fine." Sharper now, the tone he used when he wanted the subject dropped. "We have work to do. The album needs to be finished." He pulled himself up using the edge of the mixing console, and Susan watched him suppress another wince of pain. Watched him school his features back into neutrality. Watched the artist reassert control over the human being who'd just been lying unconscious on the studio floor. And Susan Rogers faced a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could push. She could insist. She could call for help or confront him directly or refuse to continue working until they addressed what she'd just witnessed. She could use her position, the 5 years of trust they'd built, to force this conversation into the open. Or she could do what he was asking, what the industry expected, what professional discretion demanded. She could accept his explanation, ignore the evidence of her own eyes, and get back to work on the album that was almost finished. 5 years of loyalty, 5 years of discretion, 5 years of being the trusted insider who knew when to look away. Susan picked up her notebook. She didn't pick up the coffee she'd dropped. She didn't look at the prescription bottles on the floor. She moved to her position at the mixing console and began pulling up the previous day's session files. "Which track did you want to start with?" she asked, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. Prince settled into his chair, adjusted the speakers, became, once again, the focused artist rather than the man who'd just been found crumpled on the floor. "Track 3, he said. "I've been thinking about the intro. It needs something." And they went back to work, as if nothing had happened. As if Susan hadn't just watched the greatest musical mind of their generation nearly die on a studio floor. As if those prescription bottles weren't still lying scattered across the carpet. They worked for 6 more hours that day. The album was completed. Sign of the Times was released in March 1987 to critical acclaim. It's now considered one of Prince's masterpieces. Susan Rogers stayed for 1 more year. She engineered parts of the Black Album and Lovesexy. She continued to do exceptional work, to be the consummate professional, to maintain the silence that was expected of her. But something had broken that morning at 5:47 a.m. Every time she walked into Paisley Park after that, she remembered what she'd found. Every time Prince winced or moved stiffly or took a break that lasted slightly too long, she wondered what was happening that she wasn't seeing. Every time she saw those prescription bottles, and she saw them more frequently as 1987 turned into 1988. She remembered the choice she'd made to look away. In early 1988, Susan Rogers left. Not dramatically, not with confrontations or accusations. She simply told Prince she needed to move on, to explore other opportunities. He accepted her resignation without much emotion, already focused on his next project. She never told anyone the real reason she left. Not for 20 years. Not until Prince was already gone, dead from the very thing she'd witnessed destroying him that April morning in 1987. Dr. Susan Rogers. Because she went back to school, got her PhD in cognitive neuroscience, became a professor studying how the brain processes music. Finally spoke about that morning in interviews after Prince's death in 2016. She talked about the guilt, about the silence, about the impossible position that people in her role are placed in, where loyalty and discretion are valued more than intervention or honesty. She talked about how the music industry creates cultures where artists' self-destruction is normalized, where physical pain is expected to be endured silently, where asking for help is seen as weakness rather than wisdom. She talked about how genius doesn't protect anyone from addiction or pain, or the slow erosion of hope that comes from trying to be more than human for too long. And she talked about 5:47 a.m. on that April morning in 1987, when she walked into a studio expecting another day of making history, and found instead a man dying in slow motion while everyone around him pretended not to notice. 29 years later, on April 21, 2016, Prince would be found dead in an elevator at Paisley Park. The cause was an accidental fentanyl overdose. The pattern that Susan had witnessed in 1987 had continued, had escalated, had finally consumed him entirely. The prescription bottles had multiplied. The pain had worsened. The isolation had deepened. And the silence, the professional, industry-sanctioned silence that values discretion over intervention, had allowed it all to continue until there was nothing left to save. Susan Rogers carries that morning with her still. Not just the memory of what she saw, but the knowledge of what she didn't do. The conversation she didn't force. The help she didn't insist on getting. The moment when she chose the music over the man and told herself it was professionalism when it might have been something darker. We all make those choices. In our own lives, in our own ways. We see people we care about hurting themselves, and we tell ourselves it's not our place to intervene. We value privacy and discretion over difficult confrontations. We enable while calling it respect. Susan Rogers learned at 5:47 a.m. on an April morning in 1987 that silence has a cost, that loyalty can become complicity, that genius doesn't make anyone invincible. She learned it too late to save Prince. But maybe not too late for the rest of us to understand that the next time we see someone we admire slowly destroying themselves, professional discretion isn't always the right answer. Sometimes the loving thing, the brave thing, is to speak up, to intervene, to refuse to be silent, even if it costs us everything. Because in the end, the music doesn't matter if the person who made it is gone.